Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3 Iron and today we are taking a look at this particular Blade Flurry Impale Champion. I think this is going to be a very fun build to play. You can play it as either a Reaver, a Lacerator, or as a Blade Flurry character. We will, of course, take a look at some of the gameplay from FatFat664 here, but this is a wonderful build guide. I have said it here over the last couple of weeks. I think Champion and the Impale mechanic in general are very underrated. I think Champion as an Ascendancy is very underrated. I think a whole bunch of people right now are running as quickly as they can in any direction away from Melee for the 3.9 Metamorph League. And so I think this is a great opportunity. Again, if you're interested in a build that is going to be maybe a little bit flanking the meta, I think it's going to come in as something that is going to be meta for a couple of reasons. I think the fact that Legion is back on Zana's map mods and is now farmable means lots of people are going to be farming 4-way and 5-way encounters in order to generate those timeless jewels, which means people are going to want to figure out ways to do that fast and efficiently and be tanky enough to get that done quickly. Champion is one of the ascendancies that can do that very well by triggering adrenaline and then by constantly re-triggering adrenaline throughout the fight. It's just a massive steroid. It's great as an early game character. And then, of course, as you scale currency into it, as you play in throughout the course of a league, as a league matures, you can dump more and more currency into a character in order to see its clear speed and its boss killing skyrocket and speed up throughout your level of investment. So, without any further ado, let's take a look here at some gameplay footage we've got pulled up here from Scent on the 3.7 version of the build. This particular build and gameplay feature is showing off using Reeve as well as Blade Flurry. He's of course going to use Blade Flurry on the map boss, and he's using Reeve for clear. So you can see it's an incredibly fast pack clearing ability, and of course he's got knockback added onto his melee abilities because he's using a Lion's Roar, and he is a crit build, so of course he's also using a Diamond Flask. So the damage on this guy can scale as much as the investment that you can put into it throughout the course of a league. If you want a league started out with Resolute Technique, you could do that, but it is something that as you continue to scale your currency up, the damage is going to go up and your clear speed is also going to match. So that's just a little bit of the gameplay footage of the build to give you an idea of what this particular build feels like. Now, taking a look at some of the pros and cons. There were changes that happened in 3.8. He's doing a really great job of keeping this updated, and this will be updated hopefully continually throughout the 3.8 particular build cycle. Now, a couple of things to note here. First off, with his gear slots, he puts in here, in his gear slots, two fancy foils. And we'll take a look here at the tree in just a minute, but I do want to mention this. The reason why this particular build is going to change, it's not necessarily going to get nerfed here in 3.9, but it will get changed, is we all know that multi-modding is getting changed the way how it's being built. So it's going to be more important now to craft up your foils and to actually have built-in attack speed on the rolls from actually crafting it rather than master crafting it or multi-modding it, but from actually just straight up rolling increased attack speed and increased physical damage on to your fancy foils. So these are incredibly expensive versions of these foils. These do not need to be purchased in order for this build to get off the ground. He's got a budget option. You can go with 2 Ichimangis, and those will do just fine for clearing most of the game. Now, in the helmet slot, he is using an Abyssus. So, if you're looking at this build and considering it for hardcore, I would say no. Just because you're going to have increased damage taken. But if you're playing softcore and you don't mind dying every once in a while because Abyssus is going to lend itself to getting one shot every once in a while, well, this is just straight up like an additional weapon slot. I know a lot of people like to hate on Abyssus as a helmet because, well, it's, oh, iron, it's additional physical damage taken and you're just going to walk around and never gain XP. Well, you'll be fine. You'll get to level 90 or so, and then maybe if you continue to push the build, yes, you might die over and over again, but realistically, if you're at level 90, you should be farming content that you're getting currency to where you could upgrade to a rare helmet if you wanted to. But adding 40 to 60 flat physical damage to a build that is primarily dealing physical damage, that is a massive amount. of flat damage that gets added on, and so I would highly recommend using the Abyssus, and early on it shouldn't be too expensive. Okay, so let's jump over to the passive tree. This particular passive tree has got a couple of tweaks that you might want to make, but it's a pretty straightforward passive tree. You're going to grab life as you can through various nodes like the Golem's Blood, or coming up and grabbing Constitution relatively close to the Scion Life Wheel. Again, my advice when you're coming up into the Scion Life Wheel is to grab Constitution first, and then of course as you're dying in softcore, or as you're taking damage in hardcore, fill in those 5% bubbles as you can as you level. But other than that, for the most part, you're going to want to fill out your far branches first, because on the farthest extremes of this particular build are your most important damage dealing, scaling passives. So coming up and grabbing Disemboweling is going to be where you're going to get the vast majority of your crit. Again, if you level up and you're leveling early and you don't have items, you can go Resolute Technique, and that just helps with your consistency of hitting. And then when you need to change over, once you get into maps, let's say, and you start getting some items that actually have some crit chance on them and some crit multi, then you can always swap over to Disemboweling at that point. You're going to come over and grab Blade Master, which is incredibly important. You could play this build, let's say if you're going Lacerate or Reeve and don't really want to go Blade Flurry, you could do that by not using swords, but swords are by far going to be the best way to scale up Blade Flurry. Blade Flurry in its damage is going to scale by how many times you can get to that max level of stages on Blade Flurry, and so what you want to do is you want to try and attack as quickly as possible to get to that max stages, and because we're an Impale build, the more times we can stack Impale, the better, right? That's the whole concept of the build. So you want a lot of hits happening very quickly to get to that max level of stages of Blade Flurry, and then pop goes the weasel when you actually hit your max stage of Blade Flurry. A lot of the time when I've been messing around with this build here over the last 48 hours or so on standard, a lot of the time stuff just dies as you're 1 or 2 tapping it, but again, that's once you actually have some decent gear. As you're leveling, you are going to notice that you're going to need to use Blade Flurry and get it up to that max level of stacks as you're popping bosses. Now, coming all the way over onto the right side of the tree, this big wheel is going to be a bunch of damage for you, coming over and grabbing Brutal Blade and then grabbing Fatal Blade as well. Those are the two extreme sides of the tree that you really need to get to that are going to help you with damage. In between all that, there's some mechanics to pay attention to. There is, of course, Vol Pact, which is going to help you with your life leech rate, and then of course as you are progressing through the labyrinth, you are going to want to get Master of Metal relatively early, because if you've got Impale support and you're planning on using Impale as a primary DPS mechanic as you're leveling through even the 10-act story campaign, then get Master of Metal as soon as possible, as soon as you can. Another approach could be to go up and grab Conqueror first, so that way then you're always taunting whenever you're hitting throughout the story campaign, and then grab Worthy Foe, which is going to provide you with some more consistency. Oftentimes what I find as I'm going through the story is if I don't necessarily have great gear, then it means that I need more hits in order to kill what's in front of me anyway. So I'm going to want to get those Impale stacks going and really get my Impale effects going earlier rather than later. Now, speaking of Impale, this entire node is something for your consideration, because enemies do now have a total physical damage reduction against Impale hits mod that is on them as a defensive layer. So I think personally what I will do is I will probably go here first, actually, as my very first damage wheel, because it's relatively close. So we're talking within, I don't know, maybe 25 levels or so. Certainly by the time you get Blade Flurry, and certainly by the time you clear Act 3 and get into Act 4, you're going to be able to come down and get Swift Skewering, which is going to be very helpful to lower those enemy resistances against your Impale effects. So even though Impale has gotten some new mechanics to interact with it, I still think it's going to be an incredibly strong mechanic, especially this league when we're going to have a bunch of new influence item types that we're going to be able to use and take advantage of in order to deal a whole bunch of damage. So I think from a physical standpoint and from an Impale standpoint, from stacking our effects, I think Blade Flurry is actually one of the better ways to do this, to stack as many hits as you can, as quickly as you can, and then have one single big pop. I think Blade Flurry itself, as we take a look at the skills here, is one of the more mechanically interesting skills in all of Path of Exile. When it first came out, I built an entire character around it. I really enjoyed playing it. Hopefully you too will enjoy playing a Blade Flurry character here in 3.9. I think it's one of the best boss killing skills in the game, because as you get better at playing with Blade Flurry, it's something that is capped by your skill level as a player, not necessarily always by your gear level, right? So if your gear is at a specific level, two players could play with the same gear, and one of them could actually accomplish content much, much faster than another, because they're timing their Blade Flurries when they're releasing at 6 stages versus somebody else who's not, who's maybe overcapping it, or who's maybe simply sitting and channeling too long. Now, infused channeling did get dinged with the patch notes. So as a support, we're going to be doing slightly less damage with infused channeling. I think that's fine. It's still bonkers damage when you compare infused channeling to anything else that you would put into that spot, except for, like, you know, damage on full life. Other than that, which is just a ridiculous gem to begin with. Other than damage on full life, infused channeling is still a great, great option for you to put your Blade Flurry in. Now, while you're using Blade Flurry and stacking all of that melee physical damage, you're also going to want to use Brutality. This is a pure physical damage build, so you're not going to want to be scaling up any kind of elemental damage, and you're not going to want to be using at Ziri's Promise Flask, because you're not going to gain any extra damage as Chaos, because Brutality says you just don't. You don't. The only damage that you deal is physical damage. So just don't do it. Just don't do it. Okay. Just physical only. Focus on that. Now, something that's going to help your leech rate is going to be using Blood Rage, which is quite helpful. It's also, of course, going to help you with some charge generation. Then on the defensive layering of this particular build, you've got Enfeeble on a cast when damage taken setup, along with Molten Shell, or preferably Vol Molten Shell, and then several different active auras, including Pride for offensive output, Flesh and Stone, Blood and Sand, and Dread Banner. Of course, if you're in Blood stance and all of this stuff, it's just a bunch of extra damage for anything that is close to you, and because you're melee, you're always close to stuff. So this build really does stack a lot of different layers of offenses on top of each other in order to clear efficiently and effectively both mapping and bossing. Now, we've mentioned items a little bit. These are very, very top-end, top-of-the-line fancy foils in terms of crafting at this point in time. And again, some of those crafted mods are no longer going to be available at the tiers that they're available now, and simply the number of crafts are going to be less or fewer on each weapon, because, you know, the mod can have multiple crafted mods is now simply capped, right? So you're going to see that some of the market for these sorts of weapons is actually going to go up because it's going to be tougher to roll the top end of these. But I think what's going to happen is the middle of the market is actually going to fill up with a whole bunch of people trying to create top-end swords and not necessarily making the best of sword possible. And so they're going to end up selling it. Which is great. They might end up multi-modding it with 1 or 2 mods just to end up finishing a craft and making it look good, and you will be able to find several different swords that are going to look good. They're not going to be this good early on, especially early on, but you're going to find some swords that are going to be great. And of course, you can always go over to Ichimonji as needed when you're early on. One of the things that I recommend when I'm leveling as melee is to simply go and search for the weapon type that you're using, that you're specializing in, so in this case sword, and simply sorting for the level requirements that you're at, and just go for the top level, like the top level requirement that you're at. So if you're at level 43, let's say it's going to be level 43 and below, and then go search for whatever does the most physical damage at the highest attacks per second, right? Because as soon as you're using Blade Flurry, you want to be attacking quickly. And of course, using things like Whirling Blades as our movement ability, again, we want to have fast attack speed. So if you can get a sword that attacks incredibly fast, it's going to help carry you very, very early on. And oftentimes, with a single chaos drop, you can pay for a weapon that's going to carry you 10 to 15 to 20 levels throughout the 10x story campaign. We've already mentioned Abyssus, but another unique that we need to mention here is Hemophilia, the serpent scale gauntlets. These particular gauntlets are incredibly effective for clearing packs because of this very specific line. Bleeding enemies you kill explode, dealing 5% of their maximum life as physical damage. Attacks also have 25 chance to cause bleeding, and then you get 30% increased attack damage against bleeding enemies. Bleed is very, very strong in this particular league. In fact, I think a lot of people are going to choose to play Gladiator just to try out bleed stuff, but for no other reason than simply because of the pack efficiency and explosions that can happen. You're going to want to go with Hemophilia, because the quality of life of blowing stuff up essentially saves you from, let's say, using a Herald of Ice or a Herald of Ash style effect that you would need to pop an entire pack once you get a chain started. Hemophilia fills in that particular niche that this particular build is looking for. Other than that, these are some pretty generic looking rares, right? On boots, you're looking for life and of course resistances. On your amulet, you're looking for flat physical to attacks as well as global crit strike multi. By the way, early on, just save up essences or even buy them and combine them, because you can get some fantastic rings crafted just by going with essence crafting. And so many people overlook essences right now and think they're just terrible. And for the most part, in terms of value in the trading market, they are terrible. But in terms of actually crafting yourself early game gear that's going to get you into maps and progressing, essences are fantastic. There's nothing available at the same level as essences that do the job quite as well. So grab yourself a steel ring as soon as possible, or an iron ring earlier, and then scale that up using essences with getting the essence crafted flat physical damage to attacks. You can also go with diamond rings. That'll give you increased global critical strike chance, but I wouldn't worry about that early on until you get into maps when you're really scaling that crit multi and that crit chance up as high as you can go. In terms of jewels, what you're looking for is damage and crit chance while you're dual wielding, or damage with swords along with life. That's pretty much the generic jewels that you're looking for. So life, damage with swords, damage dual wielding. Maybe occasionally you'll look for just a big crit jewel that's, crit chance and crit multi, but those are going to be incredibly expensive. Oftentimes, jewels that are specifically set for a certain weapon type lose a lot of their value. So you can take advantage of that early on in a league by simply sorting for stuff that's got damage with swords and that has life. You might actually find yourself grabbing some great jewels early on for relatively low price that's quite affordable for you and for your build. All right, well, that is this particular build by FatFat664 for the Blade Flurry Impale Champion. I know that I am going to definitely be playing a Blade Flurry Impale Champion at some point throughout this league, and so I'm looking forward to giving this thing a shot during Metamorph. Again, if you can time out your Blade Flurry explosions and learn to play those well, you will reap the rewards in a boss-killing league, which, of course, 3.9 Metamorph is going to be just that. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Drop us a comment down below with your own thoughts on the changes to Impale and exactly how strong a Blade Flurry Impale champion might be in the upcoming league, and whether or not you plan to use this particular outline or maybe make your own outline for a build in the upcoming league. I hope that 3.9 is the league a Mirror of Calandra drops for you. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.